In early October of 1979, something remarkable happened in the heart of American political power. For the first time in history, the leader of the Catholic Church arrived at the White House. Pope John Paul II, still early in his papacy but already a towering global figure, was greeted on the South Lawn with a welcome that blended statecraft, spirituality, and spectacle. It was October 6, a cool fall morning, and President Jimmy Carter stood ready with First Lady Rosalind Carter, Vice President Walter Mondale, and his wife Joan. As the Pope stepped from his open limousine, thousands of invited guests leaned forward with quiet reverence. Then came a simple, human moment. He gently kissed 11-year-old Amy Carter on the cheek. The crowd smiled, and in that gesture, the day's history felt personal. It wasn't just another visit from a foreign dignitary. This was a spiritual leader who had captivated millions across the world, and America was beginning to fall under his spell. John Paul II was youthful, magnetic, and fluent in the moral language of the Cold War. Born Karol Wojtyla in Poland, he had seen the worst of totalitarian regimes firsthand. Now, as Pope, he carried the quiet strength of a man who had survived both the Nazis and the Communists, and he had no intention of remaining silent about injustice. President Carter opened the official greeting in Polish, Niech Bedzi Bog Pochwalony, may God be praised. The Pope answered in English with a warm acknowledgement of the moment's significance. Their public words were polite and respectful, but the real conversation would take place inside the Oval Office, away from the cameras. For nearly an hour, the two men spoke not as politicians, but as, in their own words, Christian brothers. They discussed a long list of global challenges. The tense situation in Eastern Europe, human rights abuses in South Korea and the Philippines, rising authoritarianism in China, and the fragile search for peace in the Middle East. One issue in particular, nuclear arms, sat heavily on both their minds, especially as the U.S. Senate debated the SALT II treaty. Though no formal agreements were signed, the symbolism was profound. Here was the leader of the free world sitting across from a pope who, without wielding weapons or armies, had become one of the most powerful voices against tyranny and fear. John Paul II spoke softly but firmly of human dignity as the compelling idea of our times. For Carter, deeply influenced by his Southern Baptist faith, this message resonated beyond diplomacy, it spoke to his conscience. The mood wasn't all solemn, though. Carter, with a smile, referred to the Pope as a scholar, a poet, a philosopher, and then asked which title he preferred. John Paul II smiled back and said, "Pastor. You are right." Later, the Pope turned the tables and asked the President how he managed the weight of public attention. With difficulty, Carter admitted. The Pope nodded, saying, "I pray about it more than anything else." These small, human exchanges softened the grandeur of the moment and revealed the shared humility between two very different men entrusted with extraordinary roles. As the Pope departed the White House that afternoon, his visit to Washington was already being called historic. But it was only one chapter in a tightly packed, emotionally charged week that took him across 6 major American cities. He had landed in Boston on October 1, greeted by cold rain and excited crowds. There, despite the weather, he delivered a homily about forgiveness, dignity, and spiritual renewal, a theme he would return to again and again over the course of his journey. New York was the next major stop, and it offered a stage perfectly suited for the Pope's global stature. On October 2, he addressed the United Nations General Assembly. His speech was no routine formality. He denounced torture, political oppression, and the use of violence to suppress religious or ethnic identity. Coming from a man who had survived the Nazi occupation of Poland and now watched his homeland suffer under Soviet rule, his words carried weight. His call for peace and human rights wasn't abstract, it was grounded in lived experience and directed squarely at the powers that perpetuated injustice. That same day, he stepped onto the field at Yankee Stadium. 75,000 people filled the seats. Entire families had traveled across states just to see him. Some clutched rosaries. Others held Polish flags. As he raised the Eucharist high during Mass, the stadium fell into reverent stillness. It was a surreal image, one of the world's most iconic sports venues transformed into an open-air cathedral. And yet, even with this overwhelming public adoration, John Paul II never lost his grounding. The press called him a rock star pope, and Time magazine would eventually dub him John Paul, Superstar. But he didn't chase fame. He used his spotlight to speak forcefully about the value of life, the evils of war, and the sanctity of the human spirit. In every city, he found new ways to emphasize freedom, not just political freedom, but spiritual freedom, too. Philadelphia offered another iconic scene. There, he led Mass on the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, with crowds stretching far down the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. He didn't shy away from controversy either. His homilies often included firm opposition to abortion, as well as a defense of traditional Catholic values. Whether people agreed or not, his message was clear and unwavering: every human life is precious. But perhaps the most unexpected stop on his tour was Des Moines, Iowa. An ordinary farmer named Joe Hayes had written the Vatican, inviting the Pope to visit America's heartland and speak to people who worked the land. To everyone's surprise, the invitation was accepted. On October 4, more than 350,000 people gathered in a sprawling cornfield to hear the Pope deliver a homily about land stewardship, faith, and the dignity of rural life. His words resonated deeply in that open space, reminding people that their work, too, had spiritual significance. By the time he arrived in Chicago, home to one of the largest Polish communities outside of Poland, it felt less like a papal visit and more like a homecoming. Children sang in Polish. Elders wept. He spoke directly to the people who shared his blood and his roots, many of whom had fled communist oppression themselves. The crowds chanted his name. His voice, in turn, reminded them of a free Poland. Of a future where faith might one day overcome fear. By the time Pope John Paul II returned to Washington, D.C., for the final stretch of his U.S. tour, he had already captured the hearts of millions. The trip had been physically demanding: 6 cities in 7 days, public masses, private meetings, global addresses, but the Pope never showed signs of slowing. His energy seemed to come from something beyond physical strength, something rooted in conviction. When he stepped onto the National Mall for his final Mass, 175,000 people gathered to hear him speak beneath the soft glow of the afternoon sun. The crowd stretched for blocks, people pressed shoulder to shoulder, many holding children on their hips or sitting quietly on picnic blankets, waiting. His voice rang out clear and solemn, even over the vast open air. He spoke again about the sanctity of life, calling it the most precious gift of all. He reaffirmed the Church's pro-life position, but also called on society to care for the poor, the vulnerable, and the forgotten. He asked Americans to be vigilant stewards of their freedoms, not to use liberty as a license for selfishness, but as a responsibility to serve others. His words echoed between the monuments of the nation's capital like a prayer and a challenge all at once. At every stop along the tour, he had offered not only a message of faith but a bridge, between cultures, between political ideologies, between generations. In New York, he had spoken to world leaders. In Des Moines, to farmers. In Chicago, to immigrants. And in Washington, to the future. His presence didn't just signal a spiritual event, it marked a turning point in how the papacy interacted with the modern world. No longer distant, ceremonial, or cloistered behind Vatican walls, the Pope had become a moral voice in global affairs, speaking not just to Catholics but to the human family. The press tried to make sense of it. Headlines called him the People's Pope, a man who blended charisma with gravitas. Protesters had shown up at some stops, criticizing the Church's positions, but even they often remarked on the Pope's personal integrity. It was hard not to be moved by him. He was warm, human, and fearless. He smiled easily, spoke clearly, and never seemed to lose track of who he was. When it was finally time to leave, John Paul II boarded his plane with a slight wave and a prayer. But what he left behind was more lasting. For many American Catholics, his visit reignited a sense of pride and purpose. For non-Catholics, it offered a rare moment of spiritual reflection. And for President Carter, it had been more than a diplomatic success, it had been a meeting of faith and principle. In the years that followed, formal diplomatic ties would be established between the United States and the Vatican in 1984. And as history unfolded, the role of the Pope, particularly John Paul II, in shaping the fall of communism and the renewal of religious life behind the Iron Curtain would become even clearer. But in October 1979, none of that was guaranteed. What was certain, though, was that for 1 week, in cathedrals and stadiums, cornfields and marble halls, a single man in white had spoken to a nation's soul, and it had listened.